Hello, everyone, and welcome to Horrifically Horrifying on the Hollywood Critics Association Network. I am not Heather Wixson. I am not Kevin Taft. I am Scott Menzel, and I am filling in because Heather Wixson is on vacation this week, and I have a fun announcement to make about the future of the show. And we're looking forward to sharing that with you. But before I go into that real quick, I'm going to introduce the other guest co-host for today, and that is Mr. Demetri Panos.
Hey, everybody. This is truly scary, Scott. And apologies to those coming in thinking they were going to get Heather and Kevin. Instead, they get the two middle-aged white guys. So,
so there you go.
Our apologies. We know it's scary, but stick around.
All right. So real quick, just wanted to kind of give you a brief overview of what's going to happen on this show moving forward. So Heather and Kevin love doing this show. But as you probably noticed from their social media posts, they are incredibly busy. Heather is working on a book. She's been a huge champion of independent horror films. So she's been very, very busy. And what we're going to do is to make life easier, and because she wants to continue doing the show, we are going to divide up the host. So what we're going to do is, you may know him over at joeblow.com, and Jimmy O will be also taking on the reins here as one of the hosts. So what you're going to notice is, over the next couple of weeks, you're going to notice a rotating chair of hosts. It may be Kevin one week, it may be Jimmy another week, it might be Heather another week, and then we're going to add one more person into the mix. Don't know who that is yet, but it'll be another HCA member. So we just wanted to let you know how that is going to go. And just to let you know, just being completely honest, the next 2 weeks after this one, Heather and Kevin will be back. And there is a special episode coming up with some interviews that is going to be taking place in 2 weeks from today. So stay tuned for that. And without further ado, we're going to jump into this week's episode with Demetri and I. So I want to start off by doing something that Heather introduced during the first episode of the show, and that is handshake horror movies. And the way this is best described, for those who have not tuned into this episode or any of these episodes prior, it is basically where we talk about what horror movies we love, and if we were going to meet another horror fan, how we would introduce ourselves as, I am a fan of this movie. So obviously we're not just going to pick one movie. We are going to do a couple of them, but I'm going to turn this over to Demetri real quick and ask Demetri, what are like 2 or 3 of your handshake horror movies?
That's a great question. It's a great segment. Going back to your host things, I think that's a great idea. They're like ghost hosts. They appear and disappear and then reappear again. I think that's great. So my handshake horrors, I think very easy. Halloween, the 78 version would be one. John Carpenter's Halloween. As those who've watched and followed me and know me, Halloween's my favorite horror movie of all time. And that's movie number 1. Movie number 2 for me would be Jaws. Jaws was my first, let's say, where I put on my big boy pants, and I was only 9 when I saw it. So, but it was like the first true like horror movie I watched in a theater, and it impacted me forever going forward. And so I think that those 2 movies right there, and any of the Universal classics, Dracula, Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, Invisible Man, The Wolf Man, and of course Abbott and Costello Meet the Invisible Man. I think, or Frankenstein. I think any one of those Universal classic movies, I would love. Like, that's great conversation. But Halloween and Jaws for horror are two of the ones that I would really talk about. So there you have it.
All right. Thank you, Demetri. For me, I think I've been on record. I said this numerous times over various shows over the years. I've recently started to get more and more involved in horror movies, and I think that's a lot of people have, which is going to be part of the conversation that we're going to talk about later on about the Oscars. So growing up, I didn't really watch a lot of horror movies because I lived in a household where, to be perfectly honest, my mom wasn't a fan. So therefore, I didn't get to really watch any of them. So the two that I remember fondly growing up, and I have to throw these out there because I do believe they're classics and probably some of the best horror movies. The first one would be Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, and the second one would be, of course, The Exorcist. Those two movies scared me to death as a kid. I mean, still to this day, and even my wife, whenever we go out to a restaurant and like a bird lands next to us, we are petrified of that. We're like, get the hell away. And Exorcist, I mean, still to this day, I think it's incredibly scary. And Linda Blair in that film, truly haunting and one-of-a-kind performance from her. If I was going to say more of the modern ones that I kind of started to like as I grew older, I'm going to be honest, I'm also into a lot of like horror comedies or stuff that's kind of cheesy. I'm not someone who would say like a Hereditary or a Midsummer. My cup of tea is more or less things that are fun. And if I had to say two of those, I would actually go with the Child Play series. I love Chucky. And I especially love when they actually became more tongue-in-cheek with Bride of Chucky and Secret Chucky. I really, really enjoyed those. And surprisingly, the other one, which I know like people are going to either be like, yeah, or totally like, oh, really, is the Leprechaun franchise. I just, Jennifer Aniston in the first one, and then the second one and the third one. I mean, when you get to the fourth one where they go into space, they beat you Fast and the Furious, by the way. They beat you. They started getting a little ridiculous, and then when he went in the hood, and then they did that soft reboot with one of the wrestlers. That's where it lost me. But to me, those first three movies, especially the one in Vegas, I love the one in Vegas.
Yes.
So that's what I would say. So much different picks from Demetri, but hey, isn't that the great thing about horror is that everyone has a different take on horror.
And they not only Lep not only beat Fast and Furious, but he beat Jason. As we're sticking into horror as well, he beat Jason. It's fascinating you mention The Exorcist, because that always comes up in a conversation that I have with another horror fan. Right? We'll talk about The Exorcist, and it's a great handshake movie because, well, for me personally, I still to this day have a hard time watching The Exorcist. It's a primal fear. And the last time I actually saw the movie from beginning to end was when that special edition director's cut was theatrically released, and I saw it at the Village Theater in Westwood, and that was the last time. I mean, I own it. I haven't even popped in the Blu-ray because it's still today. I don't know. There is something about it. Friedkin's direction was so spot on, but Ellen Burstyn and Linda Blair, as you said, are so fantastic. But so isn't Max von Sydow, and the character, the actor that played the other priest, whose name I forget right now, who played Demetri. He was the Greek priest. Yeah, it's a really scary film, and we're going to talk a little bit more about it later. because it really is relevant to the conversation that we're going to have. That I think is a fascinating conversation. I hope you find it too.
Yeah, me too. So I mean, we wanted to talk about this briefly, and then we'll move on to the main topic. But during the pandemic, over the last year, I mean, it's been a year and a month since the world pretty much shut down, and it seems like we're going to be opening within the next month at most. So
tomorrow
probably
tomorrow,
just like a real life horror movie. Just speed it up. Anyway, no politics on this show. We wanted to talk about all these horror movies that have been going to streaming platforms, and there's been a lot of them that have gone to a pop-up streaming platform that pretty much was launched. I think it may have existed prior to the pandemic, but I think when all the content was really poured into it was during the pandemic.
Yes.
And that, of course, if you're a horror fan, you know what this is, and that is Shudder. Shudder is a exclusive horror-specific streaming platform. So if you're a guru or aficionado of horror movies, you probably have this service. If you don't have it, well worth your time, especially since it's only $5 a month. Demetri, you found some hidden gems on Shudder, and I would love for you to talk about the ones that you found.
Absolutely. I think Shudder, you said gurus and aficionados. I think for anybody who really enjoys horror movies, and it did come out before the pandemic, because I remember talking about it over some bourbon and cigars with my friend Paul, because we were talking about Shudder, and I believe he subscribed to get some movies, and this was just before the world shut down. It really is a very interesting service. And to what you were saying about the pandemic, yeah, that's when they started to get, I believe, a ton of content and putting it out there. And yes, I recently, within the past month and a half, reviewed 2 movies that I saw that are broadcast on Shudder that are really good, very different horror movies, but each very good in their own ways. One of them is a movie that I turned on to, Slaxx, Slaxx, a splatter movie with a message. And man, I had so much fun watching this movie. And it's about a pair. It's about these designer jeans making their debut at a H&M Gap-like store in Canada that come to life and start killing people in rather grisly fashion, if you can believe it or not. There's a reason why this happens. The movie delivers on the splatter and the gore, and it also doesn't necessarily beat you over the head with a message, but it will also make you laugh. So it's a splatter film, a message film, and it's a little bit Bollywood as well, and purely enjoyable. The other movie that I really liked that I saw recently is a movie called The Power. This movie takes place in London, England, during major turmoil happening, which was causing the government to do these rolling blackouts. And this brand new night nurse, first day on the job, she has to help evacuate patients into a much better hospital that won't be suffering through this. And at the same time, then she's tasked with doing an overnight shift and assisting in the ICU area. And this hospital, we come to find out, has some secrets buried within its walls. And it just so reminded me of the first Conjuring movie. It reminded me, it had that James Wan, great kinetic, good jump scares, earned jump scares, and really, really good suspense. I can't recommend it enough if you're a horror fan, and it's a good reason to get Shudder. It's called The Power. So Slaxx and The Power are 2 movies that I can highly recommend that I've watched off of that service. They were movies that should have, as I was watching them, I said, Scott, God, these would have been so fun to see theatrically. Both of them in their own right, because they're so different as far as horror goes. And people would have really I think people would have enjoyed them, especially The Power, because The Power really delivered on the scares. So yeah, absolutely. Those two movies I would highly recommend. And if you have Shudder and you haven't watched either one, do so. You'll be happy you did.
All right. And I just wanted to kind of clarify a few things about Shudder. So they created their first original content on September 13th, 2018. And from then until the time of the pandemic, which was right around the 12th of March, they had 14 total original films. But I'm telling you, it was like week after week after week during the pandemic where they released another original film. One of which that you heard, I'm sure, nothing about in terms of people stop talking about it, is of course the movie Host, which took place over Zoom, and that was a huge win for Shudder. I think, we always talk about streaming platforms like we know with Netflix. It was like the Orange is the New Black and the House of Cards that put them on the map. I think for Shudder, Host was a movie within the horror community that everyone was talking about. And it really kind of got people talking about the service and the brand. And it's a shame because I know a lot of people like variety when it comes to their streaming platforms. But again, I recommend this if you are a fan of horror movies, or if you're just getting into the genre. What I love about this platform is that it does showcase all of the different genres of horror. And people forget that horror is just not about scares. There are horror comedies, there's horror dramas. There's a lot of depth within the horror community and the horror movies in general. So
absolutely.
I highly recommend checking out this as well. I think there's plenty of content to pick from. Not everything you're going to love. I'm going to be honest. Demetri, I think he would back me up on this.
100%.
There was the movie called like The Beach House, for example. Not a fan. But other people in the community loved it. So yeah, that's a great thing.
It's like almost it's like not dissimilar to any other streaming service,
right?
Which shows everything, right? And again, as much as I love horror, there's really good horror. There's the horror that's in the middle that you kind of enjoy, like as a guilty pleasure. And there's really bad horror, and some of that's on Shudder. But they need content. They have content. To your point, if you're getting into horror, or you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, partner who you're trying to get into horror, Shudder is not a bad place to start because they have such a variety. And I think that service, I personally think service, they've started ramping up and amping up and including far better films, and they've been going through movies that really they're due. Like I said, it's The Power could have gone theatrical because I really thought that they were that enjoyable, that they were that good. So they're really now going kind of above B movie, and they're acquiring really some good horror. So I think it's a great mix, and that price, $5, you can't go wrong. And I think it's part of, I think though, I don't know, I think it's also part of AMC Plus.
Is it really?
So if you subscribe, I believe so, because it's an AMC network thing.
Oh,
so
I did not know that.
I think if you're into AMC Plus, I think Shudder may be part of that deal. Because I know they're part of that AMC Networks thing. So, and I just recently learned that just because I was looking for some stuff on Shudder, and I believe it's part of that AMC network of streaming services that they have that's above and beyond just AMC and The Walking Dead and things like that. So I think if you have AMC Plus, you could check that out. Correct me if I'm wrong, please do. But I think if you have AMC Plus, that's part of the channels. It's almost like getting Disney Plus Plus, where you get Hulu and all these other packages. I think it's like that.
You actually are right.
Yeah, well, look at that. Even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Yep, you are right. And also, just so people do know, not only is Shudder full of original content, it does have plenty of classic horror movies and TV series and podcasts too. So definitely worthwhile to check out. And if you're a fan, like I said, or you're just getting into it, well worth the $5 a month. And we're all for it. So
Absolutely.
for the big conversation today, and something that I don't know if has been discussed. I don't think it has been discussed on this show yet. And we figured we tie it into this week because, as we know, the Oscars happened on Sunday. And that is
horrifying.
There it is. That's how we felt watching the Oscars.
Yes.
Screaming. Lots of screaming. We were hoping that Axe hit us. So this is fascinating because horror movies have been around since the early days of Hollywood, dating back to the original Universal monster movie, something that
even before. Even before Nosferatu. I mean, like, you had great silent, Hunchback of Notre Dame, all these great silent horror movies, then leading into the Universal classics.
So I think it's interesting to go back and look at the history of horror and the Oscars. Now, a lot of people will initially say is that Oscars always ignored horror movies, and that's not necessarily true. They were ignored in categories that I think most people know about, like the Best Picture and the Best Actor and the Best Director category. But if you go through Oscar history, they were there in Best Sound and Special Effects and Makeup. It's those categories that, unfortunately, a lot of the general public doesn't really know much about or talk about. We kind of care about those 6 or 7 main categories, and we've discussed this on previous shows we've been in. But I think it's appropriate to take a look back at all of Oscar history and kind of figure out when the first movie was nominated, what it was nominated for, up until now, and when the last time a horror movie was actually nominated. So, Demetri, you did a lot of research on this. You spent some time last night. You spent some time this morning. What did you learn? What can you tell us about the early days of Hollywood and the Academy Awards with horror?
Well, it was interesting when you asked, when you talked about doing this show. You hadn't given us any you didn't give any topics. So I started thinking, well, we're still kind of in Oscar mania. So I just did a quick Google search because I was extraordinarily curious. We know Silence of the Lambs won. We talked about The Exorcist and things like that. And I'm like going, how many horror movies actually may have won the Academy Awards and how many were nominated? And I got this crazy fact that only 6 horror films ever have been nominated for Best Picture. And only one in the history of Oscar won Best Picture, that being Silence of the Lambs. And that started me on a journey. And I don't know if you want to start this right now, but going through the movie. So first, I think it should be said, going in order. So you had The Exorcist was nominated for Best Picture. Then we go to Jaws, then Silence of the Lambs, which ended up winning. Then The Sixth Sense was nominated for Best Picture. Black Swan. And then the last movie to be nominated, a horror flick to be nominated Best Picture, Get Out. So I went to each of those years to see what the competition was, what actually won that year, and to find out if, in fact, they were nominated for other categories and did they win. as you said, because it goes all the way back to costume design, editing, special effects. And it was really, really, it was a great, fun journey because it all brought back memories of Oscar, of yore, and I and it you know, it said a lot. It really says a lot to, you know, the abomination that happened this past week, because Oscars really were entertaining. But I want to talk about that when we get to the Silence of the Lamb years. What do you have to add, like prior to the movies that I mentioned?
I mean, I think it's important to look at the initial history of the Oscars and look back at what we were talking about earlier with Phantom of the Opera and films of that nature, and how those were completely overlooked. And it wasn't really until late in the Oscars. So for some real Oscar history, 1928 is when Oscars started. Right. Just so people know. And it really wasn't until 1935, where they started acknowledging horror movies in some shape or form. And the first one to actually get nominated was The Bride of Frankenstein, which was nominated for Best Sound. It was then followed by a bunch of them in 1940 with The Invisible Man Returns, Dr. Cyclops, and The Invisible Woman. So, and all of which, again, not in categories like Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, none of that stuff, not even screenplay, more or less special effects, sound, makeup. So it was always a weird category, I think, for the Oscars to accept. But I think as time went on, they've learned to kind of adopt them, and sort of grow with them. And I think
I don't know.
What, you don't know? You don't think so?
I kind of counter that because again, with there only ever being 6 nominated for Best Picture, you know, when you look at a movie like Bride of Frankenstein, or let's talk Frankenstein.
Yeah,
I don't know how that even gets overlooked. You know, when people passing out, they had to have a warning say, you know, you're gonna, you know, this is really terrible. And it was so macabre. It was so different for the. I mean, could you? Whenever I watch it, which is around Halloween time, I go, wow. What really would it have been like to have gone? Like, number one, you're all dressed prim and proper to go to a movie, and you're watching a movie like Frankenstein. And how scary, like how did that audience react? Knowing what I know about today's audiences and how they can react to horror movies, God, it must have been something. And then when you look at Bride of Frankenstein, which to me is equally as good as the original, like it's Bride of Frankenstein is like Godfather 2 of like horror. It's that good of a movie, you know, to give it only sound. I believe the Academy too were afraid to nominate because it's saying we validate horror, and yet the audiences were already validating horror as it was becoming more and more popular. Because you have to wonder, how does a movie, moving flash forward, how does a movie like Rosemary's Baby not even get Best Picture that year? So that's why I just truly believe that there have been some horror movies that have been, for lack of better words, snubbed or axed, the better word, because maybe the Academy was afraid of the genre too much. And yeah, and then when The Exorcist came, you know, you couldn't ignore The Exorcist. You couldn't ignore The Exorcist. And I just find it's such a great to go down memory lane to see what it was up. And remember, then there was only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movies, Scott. 5 nominated. So yeah, that I kind of counter that, because for special effects, it's like, yeah, it's the best. You're right, but a lot of people, they want to look at best actor, supporting actor, actress, supporting actress, and picture,
And
then
I
maybe
just
editing.
wanted to, real quick, I wanted to go back just to, because I'm trying to, again, these topics, when you talk about them, there's a lot of history in the Oscars, and there's a lot of history with every single genre. And when I said initially that The Bride of Frankenstein was nominated for Best Sound in 1935, and I said that was the first, that was actually the second. So I do want to clarify that real quickly, and announce that it was actually Paramount's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which was the first film to ever be nominated for an Oscar. And with that film, it was actually nominated for 3 Oscars, including Best Lead Actor, Best Adapted Screenplay, and Best Cinematography. So I did want to clarify that. But I want to add to that point that it's kind of fascinating that when you had a movie like The Mummy or The Frankenstein, you essentially had to wait until Paramount came out with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in order to actually get some sort of recognition from the Oscars.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with you, Demetri, about your point about the Exorcist and how that was sort of a game-changing turn for the genre. But I also think if you look at years prior, you did have The Night of the Living Dead. You did have those Alfred Hitchcock's movies that we've talked about, like The Birds. The
Psycho.
Birds was not nominated.
It was Psycho.
Right.
And, again, and you're talking about movies that we still talk about because we love. There have been movies made about the making of those movies. And so it's just really interesting that even a person like Alfred Hitchcock would be snubbed for Best Picture in those movies, because he was known as the master of suspense. So, and those movies changed the genre. Psycho certainly did. Many people look at Psycho as being the first slasher film. So it's very interesting. But just looking at what was the pictures that were nominated and what they were up against truly is a statement to the phrase, it's an honor to be nominated, because really, I don't know. Did you have something to add, or should we talk about those years?
No, I did want to say, I even though it does not fit into Best Picture category, I would like to throw out the fact that Cape Fear was nominated in categories, and that also films like Pan's Labyrinth were nominated, and Misery. Because I think, again, these were really notable films that a lot of people knew about and were pretty big at the box office. So I think it's important to add those in, not to mention also a movie that I love, Sweeney Todd, was also nominated. Johnny Depp was nominated for Best Actor for that. And of course, one that we talked about yesterday that you love and I love is Aliens.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about Aliens and Sigourney Weaver, she got nominated. But when you talk about Misery horror movie, Labyrinth, kind of like a gothish kind of horror movie as well, but they weren't nominated for Best Picture. Cape Fear you can put under suspense thriller.
Yeah,
I think Fear is more a suspense thriller. But yeah, Misery, again, at the height of Rob Reiner's career, and Kathy Bates won I mean, she was a tour de force, but you also have to give some credit to James Caan there because he was great. And when you talk about adaptations of Stephen King novels, that is a fantastic, I believe, one of the best adaptations. But why wasn't Carrie nominated when you're talking about Stephen King novels? I mean, Carrie is a Brian De Palma classic, and it holds up today. And it's such a well-crafted horror movie that brought us so many great stars, including John Travolta.
See, this is where, it's funny because we talk about this, and this is where I think a lot of confusion lies. And I apologize because this show, is a showcase to talk about how maybe things we don't know. So just because Carrie was not nominated for Best Picture, Sissy Spacek was nominated for Best Actress. Mm-hmm. And so was Piper Laurie for Best Supporting Actress.
As her mom.
So I'm asking you, as someone who knows this genre better than I do, is it really fair to say that the Academy is ignoring horror movies because they don't nominate it for Best Picture? Because based on the stuff that we've talked about, even going back to The Birds, it was nominated for Best Visual Effects. So is it just that they don't deem it worthy enough for a picture nomination, but other categories?
Well, I kind of throw it back to, because I find it very similar to those big budget commercial box office hits that aren't horror, that don't get recognized either, but they get recognized for visual effects.
Right. So like the Marvel DC movies, basically, for the most part.
Yeah, the Marvel DC, and even looking at the 80s, what was really big, and the commercialism, like take Steven Spielberg, for example. Well, his commercial films got nominated for Best Picture, but he got snubbed a lot. But there are so many pictures that people think, oh my God, how come that didn't get nominated? That was like a really good picture. And it gets the lesser categories. So horror, again, up until The Exorcist, and then Silence of the Lambs really broke that barrier. It's fascinating to me, especially looking back as far back as 1975, to see, well, what was the competition? What may have caused? Like, number one, we can understand why The Exorcist gets nominated. You brought up the point, because it really was a game changer, and it captured American audiences. They were horrified, and it did something and showed something. The way Friedkin filmed it was utterly amazing. But what else was it up against? Why might it not have won? Well, let's take a look. So we know that it was nominated for Best Picture, right? But it went up against A Touch of Class, Cries and Whispers, American Graffiti, and the winner, the Best Picture, was The Sting. So look at some of that competition. It's hard, like, as great as The Exorcist is, The Sting's a great movie, you know, and it's hard to, like, how do you, to me, it's like really hard to say, yeah, that would have been great for Exorcist, but it's really hard to beat when you're looking at The Sting, because that too is a great movie. Now, you talk about actress, right? Ellen Burstyn was nominated as actress for The Exorcist, but she was up against Joanne Woodward for Summer's Wishes, Barbara Streisand for The Way We Were, Marsha Masons for Cinderella Liberty, and then Glenda Jackson for A Touch of Class. Ellen Burstyn was in an amazing category. Like, she was surrounded by some very talented actresses. She lost out to Glenda Jackson. Now, actresses in a supporting role: Sylvia Sidney, Summer Wishes, Madeline Kahn from Paper Moon, which I am really amazed that Paper Moon is not out in any semblance of either a Criterion or a good Blu-ray. I just don't understand that. But Candy Clark's performance in American Graffiti was worthy of a nomination. Then you had Linda Blair was also nominated for Best Supporting Actress, right? You know who she lost out to? Tatum O'Neal. Tatum O'Neal from Paper Moon. You had two extraordinarily young preteen actresses in the Best Supporting category. It is, again, that's competition, right? So then you have art direction, which The Exorcist was nominated for. It really is hard when you look at The Sting for art direction. Like how, like the Sting had the look, feel of that era so amazingly good. It's hard not to pick up. It wasn't. It was also The Exorcist was nominated for cinematography. It lost to Cries and Whispers, but it was also up against The Sting, The Way We Were, and Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Nothing for costume design. William Friedkin was nominated for Best Director, but he lost to George Roy Hill of The Sting. Also in that company, George Lucas, American Graffiti, Cries and Whispers, Ingmar Bergman, and The Last Tango in Paris, Bernardo Bertolucci. So we're looking at some severe, excellent competition, even film editing. The Day of the Jackal, American Graffiti again, Verna Fields, who we're going to talk about next, Jonathan Livingston Seagull. It lost to The Sting. So The Sting had a great year that year. The Exorcist was in some amazingly fierce, great competition. And when you look at the best pictures, you go, yeah, it's hard. There may be horror fans that will say The Exorcist may deserve it over The Sting, but I contend that there are two movies that are still playable today.
Oh, and speaking of which, jumping into the one that you're going to talk about next, Jaws. Yeah. So we have Jaws here. And I mean, just looking at the Oscar category for Best Picture that year, I mean, you talk about a hard one to top. I mean, you got One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, you got Jaws, you got Dog Day Afternoon, Nashville, and Barry Lyndon.
Yep.
Like, I mean, Dog Day Afternoon, I would argue One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and
Which
Jaws
one?
Are really like, how do you pick between those movies?
Honestly. But you again, 5 nominations. I mean, Robert Altman in Nashville, which people say, like, look at the movies that came out then, and look at the competition. There is not one movie in that 5 nominations that's not worthy. It's such a hard competition, right? One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, won, right? And Michael Douglas was a producer on that. How do you say? And again, you can kind of look at the Academy going, wow, it's this 25-year-old kid. We can't let him win Best Picture. Who knows what he's going to do next or whatever. They already had it in for him at the time, too, because they're thinking, he's made enough money. This was like the biggest movie. It was the biggest movie to ever come out at the time period. It coined the phrase blockbuster. The importance of Jaws to cinematic history is incredible, and what it led to. So the mere fact that it didn't win Best Picture, its stamp on cinematic history is forever, right? But there was something else too. It did win. Jaws did win in 2 other fields. It won. Verna Fields won for Best Editing in Jaws, and John Williams won for Best Score. Now, it's very much argued that if it weren't for Verna Fields, and if it weren't for John Williams, Jaws wouldn't be what it is today. Those 2 people, Verna Fields and John Williams, in some circles are very much credited for saving Jaws. So if anybody knows the Jaws history and the trouble that it took, and what Spielberg went through as like a 25-year-old, they really do credit Werner Fields and John Williams' score for saving that picture in what it becomes today, which is it's still a classic. I talked about it last year about paralleling it to the people and the politics of the pandemic. So, but again, look at that competition. Crazy. Crazy.
And I think this is where we go into why horror fans looking at a Best Picture category now say exactly what you led with before, that do they really care about this genre? Because now we're in 1975. Right. We are going to make, now remember, I did say that Carrie got nominated and there's a bunch of other people sprinkled in there. But in terms of the big prize, we're jumping all the way from 1975 to 1991. 1991 with this bad boy right here, The Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah. Silence of the Lambs broke when you think about it. Number one, based off of the Harris, I forget his first name, the widely popular novel. Jonathan Demme is a director coming in. You get Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins, who at the time, he was kind of having like a little downtime before Silence of the Lambs, right? So I want to talk. Let's go to. Forgive me. I'm just I'm scrolling down to Best Picture. I want to talk about. All right, so let's talk about that year. Let's talk about its competition. You had The Prince of Tides, Barbara Streisand, Andrew Karras' producers. You had JFK, which was also big at the time. You had Bugsy, Warren Beatty. You had Beauty and the Beast. Beauty and the Beast nominated for Best Picture. And then, of course, nominated and winning Silence of the Lambs. You look at that competition, those 5 pictures, each one in their own right is not only are they really good pictures, they're completely different. I mean,
yeah, they are.
They're very different. And you go, wow, what a competition. And Silence of the Lambs wins. And Silence of the Lambs like really crossed over because it had people talking and it did so well box office wise. And Jonathan Demme did so well. Like great performances. And it was a time where people accepted that horror because they liked being on the edge of their seat. It really is a great suspenseful movie. Another movie that still holds up fantastically today. So yeah, it ran, but there's something else that I want to bring up about that year's Oscar. We talked a little bit about this when we did our Oscar recap. If you remember that year, Scott, I believe it was Billy Crystal hosting, they brought out Anthony Hopkins.
Oh yeah.
And like the thing, and he had the mask on, right? The Hannibal Lecter mask. And it was a great bit. It was a great bit. And that's when actors knew they were in the business of show and they had a sense of humor. What actor today would come out as the character that they're nominated for a bit? Zero. None. Because there is no sense of humor. There is no show. And furthermore, Silence of the Lambs was such the popularity. It was such in the pop culture that people got the joke. People couldn't wait. People loved it. People ate, pardon the pun, they ate it up.
Yeah.
So it was a time when Oscar got it. They could tap in to people like again. And Anthony Hopkins, I mean, come on, he allowed himself to be carded out as Hannibal Lecter. Who does that today? Nobody. He ended up winning.
Nobody. I just like
Nobody.
that sad nobody.
And
But
he
it's
went
true.
on and he won the Academy Award for Best Actor. It rejuvenated his career. He had a renaissance after that. He was hot commodity. And he won against Warren Beatty, Robert De Niro of Cape Fear, Nick Nolte of Prince of Tides, and Robin Williams of Fisher King. That's a great gunner of actors right there. And Hopkins wins for a horror movie. That to me is it's a penultimate moment. You know, it's really great. But also, if you remember that year, do you remember what else happened that year in Oscar? I'm just going back. Oscar entertaining. I got to look at actor in a supporting role. You had Michael Lerner from Barton Fink, Ben Kingsley from Bugsy, Harvey Keitel from Bugsy, Tommy Lee Jones, JFK. The winner that year was Jack Palance from City Slickers. And do you remember do you remember what he did? He came out and he did push-ups on stage. Do you remember that moment?
I mean, also when you talk about now take a movie again, this is not horror related at all, but a movie like City Slickers being nominated, that says something too, because throughout history, if you look, you want to talk about a genre that has been even more ignored than horror, comedy, straight up comedy. And again, I argue City Slickers is still playable today. But look at this. Actress in a leading role. So Jodie Foster wins for Silence of the Lambs. Let's go back and look at her competition, shall we? We had Gina Davis from Thelma and Louise, Laura Dern from Rambling Rose, Bette Midler for The Boys, and Susan Sarandon for Thelma and Louise. Again, when you look at the caliber of movies that were out, it really is mind-boggling. Because how do you pick? Like, how do you? I think it was so much harder to pick movies and winners in yesteryear than when you have stuff today. And again, actress in a supporting role, that went to Mercedes Rule for The Fisher King. But you had Juliette Lewis, Kate Nelligan for Prince of Tides, Jessica Tandy for Fried Green Tomatoes. I mean, it's kind of crazy. And that was also the year that Terminator 2 Judgment Day came out, because that got nominated for cinematography. And that's a genre picture. So Jonathan Demme wins for Silence of the Lambs. But guess who he was up against? He was up against Boys in the Hood, John Singleton, Barry Levinson for Bugsy, Oliver Stone for JFK, and Ridley Scott for Thelma and Louise. Isn't that crazy? Like, I mean, is it just me? Like, I go, holy crap. When you look at, I think what you talk about is these levels of films. And when you say those titles, right? Like, these are titles that people recognize. Like, they're widely recognized titles.
Right.
That you can say to an average person, and they'll be like, oh yeah, I know what that is. And I think that's something that this is missing a little bit today. Not with all the titles, but with some of them.
So it gets diluted when you can nominate it up to 10. And it kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about horror. It's like, oh, well, you've got 10 movies. We could throw in a horror movie, but we know it probably has zero chance of winning.
Yeah.
Like a Get Out.
Yeah.
Or right. But they nominate it we're going to give it the courtesy, a professional courtesy. You got nominated, be thrilled. But you're nominated in the category of 10, not in a category of 5, which right. I feel is fiercer as far as competition.
Well, I do want to, jump over to, I think, on that note, I think it's good to jump over to Black Swan from 2010. Now, that's an interesting film because that technically is like an art house type movie.
Sure.
And that was something that everyone was praising Natalie Portman for her performance. She won for her performance that year. But that was something that I think had the artsy thing going for it, right? It wasn't a straight up horror movie. When you think back to when you hear the word horror movie, you think of, I think a lot of people traditionally think of jump scares. They think of something like a Nightmare on Elm Street or a Halloween or a Friday the 13th. And Black Swan was kind of like the first of its kind to open the door to these new type of horror movies that have been made so popular nowadays, like the Midsommars and the Hereditaries and the Lighthouses and the Witches and all these like artsy fartsy type horror movies.
Absolutely.
That they, that people love now, that have a cult following. And I remember seeing Black Swan and I remember falling in love with it and thinking at the time, again, so stand out, like very much like with The Silence of the Lambs. Right. You never saw a horror movie quite like it prior. No. I mean, you had like a menacing villain type character in all, staple in horror movies, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the way that Anthony Hopkins played that role, it was something to be celebrated. And then when you watch this movie, Black Swan, and you watch Natalie Portman, I think it was also Mila Kunis, who probably arguably one of her best performances as well.
Absolutely.
You kind of say, this feels fresh. This feels different.
It's very different. Very different.
But it also has that art house thing where I don't feel like that movie was as accessible.
Right. But let's talk about it. When we skipped over The Sixth Sense, right?
Yeah.
But let's talk about what.
Unfortunately, we don't have.
But let's talk about Black Swan and what it was up against, right? So that year, the nominees were The King's Speech, Black Swan, The Fighter, Inception, The Kids Are All Right, 127 Hours, The Social Network, Toy Story 3, True Grit, and Winter's Bone. Now, I can look at this list and say, okay, that's a solid list, but I could take 4 pictures out of it, like right now.
Winter's Bone, maybe?
Winter's Bone, maybe. I would even go as far as saying Toy Story 3 because I think they have had the animated by then. 127 Hours. And I'd even go as far as like The Kids Are All Right. I mean, to me, it could be an argument of either Inception or The Kids Are All Right. It depends on your taste. Right there, and just whittle it down to 4, and that's an amazing competition. It makes those other movies stand out a hell of a lot more and their importance to what it is. And it gives more gravitas to Black Swan for being part of it, So, yeah, I agree with you, but I think that it's great that Mila Kunis and Princess Amidala won an Oscar. So, yeah.
But yeah, and that, that pretty much brings us up to Get Out, which was the last movie that was nominated for Best Picture. And again, that we have to remember, and we need to put that into context, right? This was this the year of Oscar So White or the year before Oscar So White? But it was the year of Me Too and Time's Up. I do know that for a fact.
Doggy's looking to go out the side door, so he's got to do some. He's going to have a horror story in my kitchen. So I'll be right back because I do think though, but. Best Picture competition, take out 4. Out 4. Let's see how that works.
Let me look at that real quick. Yeah.
I have it up.
So for Best Picture that year, what did we have? All right, let me look at this real quick. All right. So for Get Out, the year of Get Out, there was The Shape of Water, Call Me by Your Name, Darkest Hour, Dunkirk, Get Out, Lady Bird, Phantom Thread, The Post, and Three Billboards outside of Ebbing, Missouri. This is really easy for me to take out. I would take out Darkest Hour for sure. I would take out Dunkirk for sure. I would take out Phantom Thread for sure. I would take out The Post for sure. And if someone had to twist my arm, I would probably take out either Call Me by Your Name or Lady Bird for that to get down the 5. But Get Out, I think it's important to note that there was a period of time where a lot of people were talking about horror movies, but the cultural significance that Get Out had on the period that we were in a lot of ways, it almost serves as a preview into the 2020 year, where we've had all these movies that have been tackling very important issues in Black history, from the One Night in Miami's to the Judas and the Black Messiahs. Get Out was almost like that lead-in to kind of the relationship between white people and Black people. But it was very easy to see why that movie was nominated and why it was celebrated, because it was a different type. Again, very much like Black Swan, it was a different type of horror movie. The white people were the villains in the movie, and the way that it was constructed was very unique to something like a Twilight Zone episode. And to me, it was an easy call for that to get a Best Picture nomination. Demetri, I know you're back.
Yeah, no, I think everything you said was great, but to me, it also brought horror back to being kind of like the message movie, as you were talking about, right?
Yeah.
When we look at horror movies, like I consider Halloween a product of its time. Get Out is a product of its time.
Yes.
I think many horror movies are a product of the time in which they were written and made. And I look at Halloween, I look at it many ways, but one of them is like a kind of message movie of its time. And Get Out did it in such a way that you could feel uncomfortable in a theater, but you had great performances all around. I want to talk about too, like what it went up against. And again, why I think having the up to 10 nominations is kind of silly. So, because that year, and I think I can easily take out 4 movies.
Well, I already did that when you were gone.
So, okay. So what were your 3?
So, I mean, I was going down, I was saying that to me, the easiest one to take out, there's two of them that to me, I would take out without question. Darkest Hour and Phantom Thread. Like, there's no question. And then very, very easy also for me would be The Post and Dunkirk.
See, and for me, Phantom Thread for sure. For me, it would be Phantom Thread, Lady Bird. To me, it was a toss-up between The Post and Three Billboards, but I think I would toss out The Post only because we've seen that kind of movie in a sense before. It's a good movie, but and then I would have gone. I would have taken out Call Me by Your Name.
Oh, I mean, my personal opinion on that, I would have taken that out too. I mean,
yeah.
And I think this is where, and we don't have time to go into this on this episode. Maybe we'll pick it up on Trending in Hollywood if you guys want to tune over to that on Friday. This is where I think goes to show you that there's a lot of like movies that have questionable doubts of whether or not they should be in these categories. Because just this conversation that we had where you're kind of like, well, I would take this one out and I would take that one out. But when we were talking about the earlier days, the conversation wasn't like, oh, which movies to take out. It was like, oh, that makes sense that was nominated, and that makes sense that it lost.
Right.
As opposed to here, where I'm kind of like, man, maybe you should take out half these movies.
Yeah, and doesn't it strengthen the nomination? Doesn't it strengthen those 5 pictures? Doesn't it make it so that it really is an honor to be nominated? And when you talk from a marketing perspective, isn't it, when you're looking at the microcosm of 5 movies that represent a year of film, it really puts those 5 movies in a great, amazing spotlight. And to me, it makes it harder to choose. It's, to me, like every year we do our Oscar ballot predictions, and I think when you just have 5 to go on and 5 strong pictures, and look at the ones that we talked in the past, it really makes it harder to choose. I think one way the Academy could change is go back to 5, so that if and when another horror movie gets nominated, it really means something. It means something to the genre. It means something to the people who probably went and saw that movie. And I think it means something to the overall industry, the business, because you can come up with variety, make people happy, but really make the Oscars worth something more other than just self-flatulence. I mean, congratulations, Pat. So, that to me, Get Out is truly worthy for what it did. But again, if you put it down to 5, that'd be a pretty freaking, that's a strong, you go, wow, what's going to win? Like, how, so anyways, but I think horror is getting its day. It's become more popular, that's for sure. Like, why couldn't A Quiet Place be nominated? Right?
I don't know. I mean, that was something that was talked about, and I mean, they even did an Oscar campaign for it, because that's actually where I met Jazz for the first time in person.
Really?
Yeah, I met her at we were talking to Emily Blunt together. It was kind of crazy, but the thing is that I don't know. It still has a long ways to go, but I think right now the long and short of this is, and a good way to end this episode is just kind of saying that Oscars is lost. We kind of said this on Monday when we did our Oscar special for Trending in Hollywood. They really need to. This was a shame that they just didn't take the year off this year and just like retool and figure out how to make next year better. But this is just, I don't know. They just seem messy. And I think more and more people have been offering their commentary on this. And I think these genres of whether it's horror or comedy or even big budget movies like an Avengers or Black Panther or Joker need to be taken seriously if they're actually in a category. But we all know right now, based on how the Oscar works, that they're just thrown in there just to say that they nominated it, where they have no shot in hell of winning. So
no, and I want to bring it back to horror because I think the audiences have proven that they like them a good horror movie. When you look at what A Quiet Place does for grosses, when you look at what Invisible Man does for grosses, and they still, when you look at the 2018 Halloween and what it does for grosses, people like to go collectively into a theater. They like to be scared together. It's entertaining. The horror genre has real at great lengths, and I think it isn't as much poo-pooed by the regular people as it may have been before. And I think people look at it and they take the genre seriously enough to give their money to watch the movie. And there's a really great anticipation. Like, I have anticipation to see Halloween Kills. I have anticipation to see A Quiet Place 2. And whatever horror film may come down the pike.
Yeah.
So horror rules at the box office. And people need not be so stuffy about it, because I think that it lends to the overall entertainment industry and business. I grew up with Saw. How about the popularity of the Saw franchise? Right? I mean, for a short time, that was the highest grossing horror franchise in history. How about Paranormal Activity? How about The Conjuring? How about what that has spun off to, and the popularity of its sequels, its spin-offs? I mean, horror does well at the box office. It's relatively cheap, and some of those movies, like I could argue, Conjuring could be a Best Picture nominee.
Yeah,
it's a really good story.
I agree with you.
There you go.
All right, my friend. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone who tuned in to watch this episode. As a reminder, we are the guest hosts of this week's episode. Next week, Heather and Kevin will be back. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you had anything to add to this conversation, please feel free to comment in the comment box below. And we will see you, Demetri and I will see you if you watch the show on Friday at 11 a.m. If not, check back here tomorrow at 11 a.m. Oh, sorry. Check back tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a brand new episode of What to Stream with Morgan Rojas and Lupe Rodriguez-Haas. And
Great
for us
show
on Friday. So thank you very much, and we'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.